Madam Chair, we're live on YouTube, but it looks like we're waiting for Ashland and Henrico County right now.
Thank you.
Mhm. So 4 out of the 6 members are present, which means you do have a quorum.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Richmond Regional Transportation Planning Organization's Vision Zero Work Group meeting. Again, welcome to everyone that is able to join us. And we will, I do believe that let me check my agenda. The statement for the regarding virtual meetings was included in the advertisement of this meeting, and therefore we should be okay to move along. Nicole, can we do attendance by roll call, please?
Certainly, yes, ma'am. Town of Ashland, Miss Amos. Chesterfield County, Miss Benedict.
Here.
Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Here.
Henrico County, Miss Smidler. City of Richmond, Chair Clark.
Here.
And VDOT, Mr. Herman.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance. Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. So right now we will do the consideration of amendments to the agenda. Does anyone have any additions that they would like to add to the agenda or amend? Hearing none, we'll move on to the approval of the January 14th Vision Zero Work Group meeting summary. Everyone should have been able to view the summary in your packets. If everyone is okay with that, we can get, I guess, Nicole, can we do a consensus vote on the approval of the minutes?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Great. So everyone that is in agreement with approving the minutes as presented, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. For anyone that's opposed, please oppose. Great. That approval of the meetings was approved. So now we're on to the open public comment period. Nicole or Chad, did we receive any correspondence via email, or do we have anyone on the call right now that would like to speak?
We don't have anyone on the call and did not receive any correspondence via email.
All right. So with that, we'll move on to number 4, the Vision Zero's chair report. And for today, it's very small. Just want to thank everyone for coming out and thank Chet for sharing with the larger technical advisory group the efforts that this region is undertaking with Vision Zero and being included in the UWP. And we're very excited and happy to have VDOT really being able to give us a tool that we can use across the region for safety. So with that, I will go into item number 5, which is the regional action plan. And VDOT will, if you could take over for me, that would be great.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, Chris, this is Stephen from VDOT.
Glad for those that could attend. We've hit the ground running pretty hard here with the work of our contractor VHB. Since they've done this before, they know what to do and have quite a bit to present today. So we're going to present some actionable things and then some to follow up on. And so I've asked for them to sort of take the reins and explain the data, since they've been into it in much more detail than I. So thanks very much. Chris, if you could introduce the folks that will be presenting.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Stephen. This is Chris Daly from VHB. I have with me my colleagues Chuck Conran and Ian Hamilton. If you recall, when we met back in January, my colleague Eric Tang was my tag team partner on the presentation. Eric's wife just had a baby the other day, so he is not able to join us, but we are ready to share with you some of our findings. I know that Chet made a lot of the material available in advance, and completely understand that that's a lot to take in, and we didn't necessarily intend for you to do so, but we did want to make it available for you to start perusing around. Hopefully with this presentation today, we'll help to make sense of all that digging that we've done, digging and mapping, and with the intent of achieving our objective, which is to develop a high injury network, both for the region and in the individual municipalities that comprise the region. Chuck and Ian have really been the lead forces in digging into that data under Eric's tutelage, Eric having done this for other TPOs around the country, and recently for the city of Richmond, helping them with their high injury network. So in a little bit, I will turn it over to Chuck and Ian. I'm not sure, do I have control of this, or Chuck, who's manipulating the presentation?
That's me, Chris.
Okay, yeah, you go ahead and, okay. As Stephen mentioned, we have made quite a significant amount of progress in the last couple of months, and we'd like to share that with you too. Again, at a higher level, not get too into the weeds in all of the 7 appendices of materials that we provided for your perusal, but we do want to give you the high level findings. Chuck's going to get into the mapping of the high injury network of KA crashes, give a little bit of discussion about some kind of consideration of whether or not we needed to include B severity crashes, especially for more rural counties, to make sure that we have enough crashes and enough clusters of crashes to really identify those corridors in most need of safety consideration. The other piece of this, after we had identified the high injury network, is what we had jumped into an equity analysis. And equity analysis, by that I mean exploring a lot of social and education and health factors and mapping that information, overlaying it on the crash network, and trying to understand how those factors may be playing a role in the types of crashes. So a causality factor, but also in starting to think about how we might address these crashes moving forward. Also, we've done some digging into the pedestrian considerations, understanding that is a focus area, not just of VDOT, but especially in this region, city of Richmond particularly, but especially urban areas where we do have a lot of pedestrian activity. So we did want to focus on the pedestrian crashes, and what we were doing essentially was looking into mimic the pedestrian safety action plan process and methodology that was applied statewide, but honing it in, refining it for the Richmond Regional MPO. So Chuck and Ian will give us a flavor of what we were finding as far as that analysis as well. And then finally, we're just going to dabble. This is really a future step to start looking at the crash emphasis areas. And what that means is looking for spots or corridors where a certain crash type may be overrepresented, signifying that that crash is happening more frequently than expected for that hotspot or that corridor. There's still some work to do in that area, but Ian will give you a quick little overview of where we stand there. And then finally, we'll round up with where do we go from here? And then we can open it up to some discussion. Chuck, you want to move to the next slide? And then just move to the next slide. And Chuck, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Chris. And good afternoon, everybody. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to discuss the first two points on this list, the high injury network and the equity analysis. And then I'm going to pass it off to our colleague Ian to handle the latter two. So first off, starting with the high injury network, or the HIN as we abbreviate it. The purpose of the HIN is that it's trying to capture a large percentage, a majority of the high injury crashes that are occurring on just a small percentage of the roadways that are within each locality. And when we say high injury crashes, we're really focusing on our KA crashes, Ks being the fatalities, and As being the ambulatory injury crashes, the types of crashes that send people to the hospital. As Chris hinted at, we had to make a decision on whether or not to also include B crashes. B crashes are your more minor injury crashes. And it really came down to how many crashes did we have in each locality? Was it a statistically significant sample size? And the answer was in our 4 more urban core, higher populated, more driving counties, localities. That would be Hanover, Henrico, Chesterfield, and the city of Richmond itself. There were enough KAs. KAs tend to be the focus of the Vision Zero effort nationally. When you talk about Vision Zero, those are the crashes that have the highest impact, the most impact on life, on property, on society. But then in the 5 more outlier counties, that'd be the town of Ashlands, Goochlands, New Kent, Charles City, and Powhatan. We had to include the B crashes so that we had enough of a crash sample size to do our analysis on. And the high injury network, the goal of it is to try to identify if there are roadways in the network that are overrepresented in terms of the crash experience in the locality. And these are the roadways that extra safety attention could be directed towards. We talk about the 4 E's in the safety world: engineering, enforcement, education, and emergency services. And those, amongst other things, can be targeted safety efforts on the corridors that are identified in the high injury network. And we have a high injury network, a draft version developed for each locality. And to discuss some of the methodology behind the high injury network, it is a somewhat subjective process. It's mapping the crashes, whether it's the KAs or the KAs and Bs, and looking for clusters, looking for hotspots, looking for corridors that seem to be representative of a majority of crashes. And we were trying to capture a majority greater than 50% of that crash subsets on our selected corridors that make up this network. We aimed to include full roadway lengths from edge of locality to edge of locality, but in some instances we did have partial segments. For example, if the eastern half of a corridor and the locality had a lot of KA crashes, but the western half hardly had any, we would focus on just the eastern half because that would be the more targeted section for safety improvement. And then finally, we wanted to look at the high injury network multi-jurisdictional, cross-jurisdictional boundaries. As a driver is going down the road, their driving experience, the crash story, it really doesn't pay attention to have I crossed from Chesterfield into the city of Richmond, for example. So for the most part, we tried to extend high injury network corridors across county lines, across locality lines. For example, Broad Street, city of Richmond, Henrico County, Goochland County, all the way out. So that's some of the methodology. I'm going to briefly show this calculation sheet just as an example. And as Chris said, these are all, we distributed all of these. I would encourage you to take a look both at the calculations and at the network maps for your locality. But I just wanted to highlight as an example. So for example, the town of Ashlands, this is the crash sample size that we have within the town over 5 years, 18 KA crashes, 206 KAB crashes, and we've got about 125 miles of roadway within the locality. From our mapping, we selected these 3 corridors as our draft high injury network. They have this mileage within the locality. These are the KA and B crashes that are occurring on those corridors. And then you see the percentage of the KA crashes of the entire locality that are occurring on that corridor and how that compares to the mileage percentage that's on that corridor. So for example, this top row, Virginia 54, we've got 50% of Ashland's KA crashes are occurring on just less than 3% of the mileage within the town. And you can see how that all adds up here. So that's the type of calculations that went behind this, that we're trying to capture greater than 50% on a very small subset of the roads so that we can target those roads. And I'll flip over now to the maps. So we've got one of these maps for each of the 9 localities within the TPO, showing the draft high injury network, as well as the crashes. So we've got a map for each of the 9 that have K and A crashes, and then those 5 localities where we also added the B crashes in, we added a map for that. So just to show you the flavor of that, for example, Ashland again, we just have those 18 KA crashes, but we've got these 3 corridors that we've highlighted as the draft high injury network, and you can also see how it extends across the locality line into Hanover. But then if we look at adding the B crashes into the map, you can see how the addition of those crashes start to tell a bigger story, and how these selected corridors are popping out even more as the main crash corridors. And then just one more example on this to show a look at some of the bigger localities with more roadways and more crashes. This focus map on Chesterfield, which you also get a good look at the city and Henrico County on it. You can really see how just the vast majority of these KA crashes are being captured on our draft network. That being said, the draft network, it is a draft network at this point in time. And since it is a large part of one of the tools in our toolbox that helps us direct safety attention, I would encourage each representative of each locality to take some time to review your locality's map and the calculation PDF that was also shared, and let us know either on this call or via email afterwards if there are any additional corridors that you want added to your locality's high injury network. We can definitely get it in there into the final version. So that's the high injury network. Next, I'm going to move to the equity analysis that Chris mentioned. The tool that we used for the equity analysis is the Health Opportunity Index, the HOI. This was developed by the Virginia Department of Health, and they developed it to determine factors that contribute to health outcomes. And those factors could be social, economic, educational, demographic, or environmental. And like I said, all those are trying to point towards, does a community have more likely to have a higher health outcome or a lower health outcome? And on a statewide level, they did this on a census tract level. That's how granular this HOI analysis got. And they broke the state into 5 quintiles, very low, low, average, high, and very high, where a very low HOI is indicative of a low health outcome, and a very high HOI is indicative of a positive high health outcome. So our goal with this analysis, and this was something that we did with the city of Richmond when we worked with them on their Vision Zero plan several years ago, was trying to find a link between the HOI at the census tract level and crashes. In other words, is the crash experience that the crashes are more likely to occur in the lower HOI zones. And in the city of Richmond, we found that to be the case. And so the equity analysis was showing us that they're more likely severe crashes happening in the low health outcome parts of the city. And that helped to drive some of the conversation. So again, I'm going to flip over here to some calculations. And again, not to get lost in all these numbers, but we've got each locality here within the TPO. We've got the number of census tracts in that locality, and we have them binned by those 5 HOI zones. So obviously, based on population, different localities have different numbers of HOI zones. The more rural ones only have 2 or 3, while the urban core localities have 60, 70 census tracts. And then our analysis shows how many K&A crashes occurred in each of those bins of HOI zones. And then what's the percentage breakdown of those census tracts within the locality by HOI zone versus the crashes. So again, we're doing an overrepresentation analysis, and that's all that the green shading here is showing is if it's shaded in green, we're saying that crash type is overrepresented in that level of HOI zone. So just for example, like I said, in the city of Richmond, and that when we worked on their Vision Zero plan, we found that over 70% of the KA crashes within the city were occurring in the very low HOI bin, which was overrepresented by 10 to 15 percentage points. When we looked at this on the regional level within each locality as part of this study, we saw some of it extending to the other localities, but it was not a universal storyline. Example, Henrico, we saw a slight overrepresentation of A crashes in the low HOI zones. But then some of these other localities, we didn't see that analysis tell us that. So really we decided, look at this from a regional perspective, and that's what this map is showing. This map is showing those HOI zones by census tract, and they're mapped on top of the KA crashes in our draft high injury networks that I shared a few minutes ago. And on this map, the darkest color represents the very low HOI census tracts, while the lightest color represents the very high HOI census tract. And as we can see from this, the lowest HOI census tracts in the region are primarily focused in the urban core. A lot of them are in the city or immediately adjacent to the city in Chesterfield and Henrico. And then we also see some at the outskirts of the region, the far west of Goochland and Powhatan, the far east of New Kent, Charles City, and then just one up on the north side of the town of Ashland. And we can see that the vast majority of the KA crashes in the region are also in the urban core. They're in these low census tract zones. So this is our preliminary look at an equity analysis. And we can continue to look at this as we move forward. And it's a good thing to think about as we think about implementation of safety measures moving forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Ian, and he's going to talk about our pedestrian analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. So hi, everyone. I'm Ian Hamilton, and today I want to talk a little bit about both the Psat analysis that we did, so covering what VDOT has done with their pedestrian safety action plan, and then tying together some overall emphasis areas, and then talking about next steps related to diagnosing those emphasis areas and coming up with specific countermeasures. So just sort of introduce the Psat. For those who are not familiar, the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan is an initiative that VDOT undertook in roughly 2017, 2018, with really sort of a two-pronged approach in mind in terms of addressing locations with safety issues. The first being looking for those hotspots. So looking for those areas that had received a significant amount of crashes or experienced a significant amount of crashes, especially those K&A crashes that Chuck was referring to. But also a more proactive component. So not just looking at locations that had already experienced a high number of crashes, but those that had sort of had the risk factors associated with an increase in pedestrian safety issues. So again, not relying on some of the more rare pedestrian crash events to occur, really taking that proactive step to addressing locations before those K&A serious injuries occurred. And so, considering all the factors that went into that proactive approach, only 4% of the score of the identified corridors is related to a historical pedestrian crash. All of the rest of the features are related to either pedestrian exposure or known issues related to pedestrian safety. And just sort of a, some of you may be aware, but as a brief update, it's been updated since 2017. So there's been recurring updates in 2019, and VDOT is currently in the process of updating this VDOT PSAP in terms of identifying those corridors. And so what we wanted to do with the PSAP analysis is then overlay the most recent crash data that we had available related to pedestrian safety, and then compare that to the second round of corridors that we identified in the last PSAP. So really trying to see where the sort of historical conditions have mapped up to that proactive approach. And so Chuck, if you don't mind sharing the Psat map. So this is the viewer, and again, it's publicly available at that URL. You could also Google VDOT PSAP. I believe 2.0 would get you to this version, but I believe both versions are in this one data viewer. So you can sort of see how the priority corridors from the statewide perspective and really district perspective are really concentrated in downtown Richmond and some of the more surrounding areas. So looking at Henrico County and Chesterfield County, that's really sort of comparing all things related to the state. So again, in competition with Northern Virginia, the Hampton Roads area, Charlottesville, it's all very, those areas really do have a strong, pedestrian exposure and pedestrian safety issues. And so, downtown Richmond is really one of those areas where you have a lot of exposure, and, it really does sort of pop in those more, relative to the state in terms of a high risk location. And just some of the changes that we've used in the updates, again, Chuck mentioned that Health Opportunity Index. That's something that, was included in the 2.0 revision, where we saw just a dramatic improvement in the ability for this tool to sort of proactively address areas of high risk, where we were seeing, more crashes being reflected in this network as opposed to the first version. And so in a similar fashion to identifying the high injury network, we did overlay pedestrian crashes and compared them to the existing PSAP network. So if you don't mind, Chuck, sharing the calculation sheet. And again, only 3 jurisdictions in the TPO have PSAP corridors. So that's Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield. But like the high injury network, we do see a lot of overrepresentation of pedestrian crashes, especially those, higher severity pedestrian crashes on the network. So for the TPO as a whole, roughly 46% of fatal and serious injury pedestrian crashes occur on the PSAP network, relative to only 2% of the overall network in the TPO being on a PSAP corridor. So seeing a ton of overrepresentation, relative. And again, only 4% of that PSAP score is historical crashes. So using those factors to address risk, address exposure more proactively, that's what the PSAP is really there for. And then looking at, Richmond, a slightly more representation of the PSAP in Richmond, so 12% of the network, roughly speaking, on Richmond streets, but over 3/4 of all fatal and serious pedestrian crashes that occurred in the last 5 years have occurred on the PSAP corridors. So again, really highlighting this tool as a really good informative way of addressing some of these pedestrian safety issues in a proactive manner. And then Henrico and Chesterfield, although they have sort of small representation along the PSAP, Henrico only having less than 3% and Chesterfield less than 1% even. You can see in Henrico, almost half of all fatal and serious injury pedestrian crashes that occurred in Henrico County occurred on PSAP related corridors. So it really is a good tool for prioritizing, where safety issues are occurring, where the risk is highest. And really, ultimately what it's coming down to is getting that return on investment in terms of saving lives and preventing serious injuries and fatalities for pedestrians. And so before I move on to sort of the overall emphasis areas, I do want to mention, and Chris will mention this later in the presentation, that we will be doing sort of a mini PSAP for the Richmond area, for the TPO. where the specific inputs won't be competing against NOVA, won't be competing against Hampton Roads for sort of that scoring, so that more areas across the TPO and in the 9 jurisdictions get represented in the overall scoring. And before I move on, are there any questions associated with the PSAP? I'll just pause momentarily. There will be a question and answer session later, but just want to open the floor just in case. Okay, well, hearing none, moving on to the overall emphasis area addressing. So the VDOT SHSP, or Virginia SHSP, is a federally mandated initiative on a 5-year scale where the state, along with its various partners at the local level and across the 4 E's, so engineering, enforcement, education, and emergency services, really take the time to look at historical trends in the state and identify areas of emphasis that need to be targeted through the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And the HSIP, as it's known, really is sort of that key federal funding mechanism to sort of get projects into the ground related to safety funds and address some of these key emphasis areas moving forward. And so what we wanted to do with a tool that's published by the Federal Highway Administration, the County Crash Summary Tool, it allows us to look at areas of various crash contributing factors and identify those factors that are significantly overrepresented relative to what you would expect. And so, you have individual jurisdictions along with reference regions, whether that be comparing, say, Richmond to the overall TPO, Goochland County to the overall TPO, or comparing the TPO to the state as a whole. We really want to identify specific crash circumstances that are overrepresented relative to that reference region, because again, each jurisdiction in each area of the TPO is different. It has its own unique safety issues. And this helps us sort of tease out where those are most important. And so, like Chuck mentioned earlier in the presentation, we really wanted to focus on areas that had that statistical significance. So looking at KA crashes in the more urban areas where there's a higher frequency of fatal and serious injury crashes, and the KAB crashes for the entire TPO. So making sure that we do have a good sample size to really diagnose some of these issues in various jurisdictions. And so with that, Chuck, do you mind showing the KA distribution? So this is the fatal, serious, fatality and serious injury overrepresentation for each jurisdiction, more urban jurisdiction, relative to the TPO as a whole. And the check mark indicates that that specific contributing circumstance or emphasis area is overrepresented relative to the TPO. And then we compared the TPO to the state as a whole. And again, this really is sort of helping us diagnose what specific issues are most important to the region. So thinking of things like intersections, roadway departure, impaired driving, speeding, young drivers, things that really help us diagnose, okay, what countermeasures and what programs can we put in place to specifically address some of these issues. And so with the KA analysis, you really do see some key emphasis on intersections, on pedestrian and bicyclist safety, especially in some of the more, the urban core of the TPO. We've also broken it down by facility type and time of day, the crash type, whether that be angle, head-on or rear. These all really, help us diagnose specific issues. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how that we sort of get into the weeds of diagnosing specific treatments and countermeasures. But this really gives us the high level confidence that we're addressing some of these needs moving forward. And before you go to the crash trees, Chuck, do you mind going to the KAB for the entire TPO? So looking at sort of the KAB distribution across the entire TPO, you really do sort of see some trends emerge, especially geographically. So looking at things like, in the more sort of rural areas of the TPO in say Charles City or New Kent, there really is an emphasis on sort of that roadway departure characteristic where you see speeding as an issue, seatbelt use is an issue, roadway departure, impaired driving is an issue. And all these things are really sort of correlated traditionally with rural road safety. So it's not terribly surprising that we see that pattern emerging in these parts of the TPO. And then in some of the more urban core, again, you see intersections popping out. You see bicyclists and pedestrians, again, overrepresented in Richmond, which is not terribly surprising given the results that we saw in the Psat. And then, looking at the facility types and functional classifications, if you scroll down to the crash types in the various areas, you see more head-on collisions in those areas where you see roadway departure as an issue, more fixed object off-road as an issue in the same jurisdictions that have roadway departure concerns. And in the more urban areas where you have intersection-related issues, you see a lot more of those rear end and angle crashes showing up. So things like Chesterfield and Henrico and Richmond, more towards those angle and rear end crashes. So not terribly surprising, but it really does help us sort of tease out where in the TPO we want to target certain safety countermeasures. And so then taking these results and sort of moving forward with next steps and how we're going to sort of refine those emphasis areas and the treatments associated with them. The first is to sort of look at crash trees to then diagnose specific contributing factors related to some of these emphasis areas. So if we take intersections, for example, and we'll see an example of a crash tree in a second, we can sort of diagnose, are signalized intersections more important? Are unsignalized intersections more important? How many legs? What's the approach information, the crash type information? All of that really helps to sort of tease out what sort of treatments should be applied at sort of a planning level to really get at sort of the jurisdictional specific issues that we see. And then focusing on specific locations, there are things like overlap analysis and Venn diagrams that really help sort of tease out areas where you see a lot of these risk factors overlapping. And really where you see those risk factors overlapping is really where you want to target those more systemic countermeasures and sort of get that systemic implementation across your network to sort of get the most benefit relative to the overall cost of the program. And so Chuck, you want to show an example of the crash tree? And so looking at that, so here's an example of a crash tree. These are not TPO related data. These are just sample data. But this is how we sort of go through that process of identifying intersection related crashes and then identifying the contributing circumstances to those intersection related crashes. So then breaking it down by traffic control type, breaking it down by crash type, how many lanes are entering each intersection, the configuration of the intersections. So are T intersections more important? Are there Y intersections, 4-leg? This is sort of how we tease out, okay, what specific issues can we sort of diagnose and how then do we apply more systemic countermeasures to address those issues. And then just very quickly, an example of the Venn diagrams. This overlap analysis really helps us sort of tease out what contributing factors sort of overlap and sort of, complement each other to sort of create these locations of increased risk. And where you see these overlap of risk factors, where you see speeding related risk factors in combination with roadway departure, in combination with impaired driving, in combination with other related factors, seatbelt use, those are the areas where you want to target those countermeasures. And so really sort of taking that, high level overview of identifying emphasis areas, identifying contributing circumstances, and then, coming up with the ability to target those specific issues on the local road network really is the cornerstone of this plan. And so that's just sort of a brief walkthrough of, taking our overview of the entire TPO and then, coming to those conclusions at the end. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Chris, where he'll talk next steps. And I think we'll have a Q&A session.
Yeah, so Chuck and Ian both already alluded to what our next steps are. Chuck had mentioned that it would be certainly ideal for each representative from the localities to take a look at the maps, take a look at the corridors that we have identified as a high injury network, and provide us some feedback. There could be additional spots, corridors that are receiving a lot of public outcry. There could be projects that have recently been done or are planned on a corridor to address a certain safety concern that maybe we're not aware of. Any number of reasons that you might have to propose another corridor or spot, or perhaps less likely, but perhaps maybe one of these corridors that we've identified shouldn't be on there for one reason or another. And that's something that we'd want to consider. We'd really appreciate your feedback. The second was the Psat analysis. Ian gave a very succinct explanation of what our next step is there as well, which is to refine that analysis to make it specific to our TPO here, so that we are not comparing our corridors against statewide data, so that we are highlighting the corridors that are rising to the top for having pedestrian crash concerns that otherwise maybe don't rise to that same level across the entire state. So that will be a next step. And then finally is the piece that Ian was just referring to, which is to continue to flesh out the overrepresentation, the crash trees, and getting a better understanding of what those prioritization lists are. We've really just started to scratch the surface as far as that's concerned. We've done a little bit here and there, but that's the next big piece of this, so that we can then, with all of this information, start to really hone in on where do we need to focus our safety, engineering, education, enforcement, and emergency response. That's really what it's getting down to. That's ultimately what our objective is here today. And of course, last but not least, is having this all documented in a fashion that is digestible by everybody, all the stakeholders on this call, a tool that will be usable moving forward into planning safety projects in the future. So with that, I do want to open it up to questions, comments, open up the floor. Chad, I know you had a couple questions in the chat. I think we've addressed them, but Chat, maybe.
Yeah, you got my questions. I think I got the answers. We were looking at the HOI for some of the stuff, other work we're doing at the TPO, and I think we also saw that it was like 2017, but I'm hoping they incorporate the new census data once they have time.
One clarifier I do want to make, and it may have been misunderstood earlier when we were showing the overrepresentation, or when you dig into the data yourselves. We did take a look at the overrepresentation for a number of criteria. That does not mean that criteria alone, if your jurisdiction happens to be overrepresented in a certain crash type, there is a minimum threshold that we would want to take into account. So good example is, railroad crashes. Ashland had one railroad crash. So it's way overrepresented, but not necessarily something that will require a lot of focus. Another great example is one-way streets. Clearly, the city of Richmond dominates with crashes on one-way streets because they have the most one-way streets in the TPO, which isn't to say that other jurisdictions don't have some, but clearly Richmond's overrepresented in having them. That's not to suggest that there's a safety reason to eliminate one-way streets throughout the city of Richmond or throughout the TPO. So I just want to clarify that little piece of it as well.
Hey there, this is Catherine Benedict from Chesterfield County. I just put a question in the chat box, but I'll just kind of elaborate on it a little bit more. Just in looking over the kind of initial maps and networks and everything, it was pretty apparent that some of our known high injury networks like 360 and 60 were not on these maps. So you kind of elaborated or touched on this earlier, but is there any way to look at different type crashes or different, approaches that we could go down if we have a known high injury network that isn't showing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's exactly the type of feedback that we were looking for from each locality. I live in Chesterfield. I live off 360, so very familiar with that corridor. Chuck, maybe you can pull up the map and maybe pull up the corridors that we did identify for Chesterfield, and maybe elaborate a little bit on why the corridors that we identified differ from maybe what Catherine instinctively would think are the high injury corridors in Chesterfield.
Sure. I just want to clarify, maybe I misheard. We do 360 and 60 are on here on the high injury network in Chesterfield. The ones that are not on here that maybe, and I didn't, I guess, clarify at this point, 288 is not on here, and neither is the Poway Parkway. Reasons for that are we excluded freeway type facilities from this analysis. So there's no interstates and no limited access facilities. So 288 Powhite Expressway, Pocahontas Expressway, those have all been removed from this analysis. I am seeing 60 and free 60 though. Did I hear you correctly, Catherine, or is there a different corridor that?
Yeah, I was talking about for pedestrian.
For pedestrians.
So if we're referring to the PSAP, that great question on that front as well. The main reason why sort of a big, and actually I'm going to have a little bit of story time and a bit of a detour here. The overall is just sort of looking at the pedestrian. So we were looking at the Roanoke Valley TPO, I think a few years ago, and they asked a very similar question about, why not electric road outside of Roanoke? Why didn't that show up? And the main reason why is exposure. The risk factors that go into exposure related to pedestrian safety just weren't present on that particular corridor, especially related to the entire state. That's not to say that when you do a Richmond level TPO analysis that it won't show up. It's just that that's typically the reason why some of the larger facilities that are more suburban don't stand out, is that the population density, the employment density, the health opportunity index, which again is a prime driver of pedestrian risk or prime corollary with pedestrian risk, it just doesn't show up there. So that's one of the main reasons why these large suburban arterials just don't show up. It's the expected exposure just isn't there.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that, I see Route 1 is on there, but 360 and 60 are huge pedestrian attractors in the county.
Mhm.
There are parts of them, they might not be typically urban, but they have pretty big urban centers along them. And I would just, if we're talking about a Vision Zero plan and those two routes don't pop up on the pedestrian safety aspect of this plan, that would be a pretty big concern for me. And I think some other folks in our department, because I think those are two huge routes that are pretty big, a pretty big focus for us right now in terms of ped safety.
Yeah, Catherine, this is Stephen, and your point about maybe considering the other severities, given sort of the safe system approach, is that any small factor could turn minor injury into a serious injury. So we can also look at that. And of course, as Ian was mentioning, the hope is that as we refine this and just look at the region and the comparison, that we would hope essentially that at least the border areas or little pieces of the corridor where we have the confluence of those factors, like you say, the activity centers, that they would pop out. And so it might not be like the whole corridor, Hall Street or Midlothian or even Route 1, that those sections may start to pop out, and we can certainly tease that out and have some flexibility to make sure that it addresses even local knowledge concerns as well. So that those are identified beyond just the hard data.
And just to clarify, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, these are the existing statewide PSAP corridors, correct?
Right.
That's correct, yes. So when we do the local level, things will certainly change.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And that's exactly the point, is that we want the 360s and 60s to pop on a regional basis that otherwise they weren't popping on the statewide basis.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Especially because on the screen currently, where the crash history is showing us that we've got severe and fatality pedestrian crashes on those corridors, not even getting to the risk factors that Ian was talking about that are more systemic in nature.
And what I was going to comment in regard to in regard to Catherine's comment, and then a comment Mike had in the, oh goodness, Mike Sawyer had in our, sorry, let me turn this down. That Mike Sawyer had in our comment about sharing this information. I think that we, it may be that some of the, if it sounded like that we talked about, there would be some that would kind of be reevaluated at the regional level, and was that only the pedestrian, or was there another section? And I say that only to ask, or to say that there may be maybe the high injury network draft, and then another section would be kind of ready to kind of share with staff right now of the localities, just to really start to give them an update on what is going on with Division Zero. And then maybe after the regional data has been applied, we'll have a firmer draft that could be shared, not only with the staff, but potentially with some of the elected officials in the region as well. Because much to what Catherine is saying, we don't want to send the alarm with some of this early data that we're getting and the early work that we're doing, really without making sure that, you know, it doesn't alarm people and then really throw off all the efforts that we're doing. And again, I specifically just, again, was talking about sharing the information and really just talking through if anybody wanted to suggest how we may, or what information would be good to share. And if you all feel comfortable with sharing the whole presentation at this time with others in your localities, then, you know, go ahead, I guess. So with that, does anybody else have any comments for VHB or VDOT?
This is Sharon with Henrico. Apologize, I joined a little bit late. But yeah, if VHB could share a copy of the presentation just for us to look over the localities, to look over the maps in a little bit more detail, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon.
Hey, Darona, this is Chet. Just wanted to remind everybody it's on YouTube too.
Yeah, sometimes the maps are like a physical static map is helpful for me, but it's also helpful the YouTube video as well. I'd prefer a static piece of paper. Thank you.
And so I think we can make sure that we get the hard copy or PDF form of these maps sent. I guess either to Chad and then he can distribute them out to the entire group. All right, so if we don't have any other questions, are there any group members' comments that would like to be made? I would just say thank you very much for the presentation. It is very informative and very exciting to see how we could potentially strategically address getting the region to zero fatalities based on, you know, strategically looking at the networks that really these injuries, the K and the A injuries occur. Is very exciting to see it at a regional level. So thank you again, VDOT, for your for the ability, for your dollars and your work into this effort. Right now, I guess we will consult with VDOT and get back to see, do we want to say, I guess, do we want to give a time frame on when localities may want to provide them with additional comments on the maps? Is 1 month sufficient?
I would think so. So sometime in the middle of June, because I think we're aiming to come back with more of the work in July. Again, maybe have another follow-up meeting with this working group. where we could, maybe show the any refinements to the high injury network, but also that deeper dive into those emphasis areas, and of course the regionalization of the pedestrian route identification. So, any initial thoughts on A, on the high injury network, B, on the use of the HOI to kind of focus, any thoughts in terms of equity? That's more of like an overlay, if you will, than it is heading towards sort of thinking about countermeasures and actions. But yeah, and then if anyone has time to dig deeper into the overrepresentation, they're welcome to do that as well and to provide comments on it. But we realized that was a lot, so I would say 3 weeks is reasonable, at least on those first couple, and then we'll provide the pedestrian work and the crash trees that Ian presented and the others, and have more discussion about the emphasis areas in July.
So do we want it to be a deadline for do we want to meet again in June, or do we want to just have the deadline for mid-June to turn these in and meet again in July?
I was thinking more of the latter, just to give everyone time to digest. It's a lot. So, and then that gives time for the VHB folks to do some of that other more specific information, particularly with the pedestrians. I know that's an issue with a lot of folks right now, and then the other emphasis areas as well. So I think we'd all be comfortable with that from our side in terms of being able to deliver good products. Okay,
great. So with that, I'll ask that Nicole or Chet, if you could, if we could probably, I don't know, I guess set somewhere for early June, or, either the second week in June, just a reminder to, maybe the last week in May, or just a reminder to everyone in the group to get any comments over. And should we send all of those over to you, Chet, or do you want me to collect them, or do you want to send them directly to VDOT?
Yeah, we'll send a reminder probably the first week in June, and if everyone could just send comments to me, and we'll compile everything and get them to Stephen and the team.
Awesome. I think that will keep everybody on track to getting those in. So we've talked about it. We look like that our next meeting would be determined for sometime in July. So we will work on trying to get a date for that and send that out. If there are no further comments or questions, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you. Have a great day.
It's been great. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for facilitating.
Yep, great job. Thank you.